Welcome everybody to a fireside chat with Alex Epstein. In keeping with the tenor of the conference, we're not having an actual fire. You can imagine a virtual fire, which is very green. And in keeping with the argument for diversity, I'm actually the MIT representative, although I haven't been there for about 18 years now. This is going to be a little bit like Monty Python, where John Cleese goes, and now for something completely different. We're going to be at a conference mostly focused on new energy technologies and especially renewables, but we're going to have Alex talk a lot about the moral case for fossil fuels. We're going to do this as a chat. I will introduce him in a moment. But I think the organizers are to be praised for having someone with perhaps a somewhat contrary point of view to many of the other speakers, because we all know the big problem these days in politics is the growth of partisan bubbles, where people just talk to the people who believe the same as they do, or if they're with people who don't believe the same as they do, they just shout at them. I blame one particular ethnic group, and I know it's not politically correct, but some of you may belong to that group. How many people here are human? All right, okay, the Caucasians are partly Neanderthal. That doesn't really count. Albert Einstein once said, everybody's stupid about something. Now, if Einstein's stupid about something, you got to figure the rest of us tend to be stupid about a lot of things. Unfortunately, in a lot of debates about public policy, you will find very few people who will admit that they have ever made a mistake or that they are uncertain in any way about what they're doing. I will refer you to, if you go to Forbes.com and you search Lynch Nobel, I'm afraid you won't hear about my Nobel Prize, but you'll find a column I wrote called How Two Nobel Prize Winning Economists Got Oil Wrong. You'll be pleased to know both the economists were MIT economists. And spoiler alert, neither of them was a resource economist or familiar with the field of oil, but neither of them admitted that. Rather, they made very certain, specific, positive arguments that were in fact completely wrong. My corollary to Einstein's argument, theory, is that everybody's biased. People often tell me, you know, you're biased because you're a consultant in the petroleum field. And I say, well, what do you work for? Well, I'm in the renewable field. And you're not biased? Oh, no. Every human being is biased. Not everybody realizes it. It's amazing. This is one of the problems I think we have with diversity, is that people are convinced they're not biased when they're sitting in a group of 12 white males who all went to Duke or Harvard or Princeton. And just to give you kind of an operational example, a few years ago, Greenpeace wrote about peak oil. Now I have a book out about peak oil, debunking it. And Greenpeace said, well, it's obvious we have peak oil because, let's face it, every 3 years to offset declining oil fields, we need to find a new Saudi Arabia, and there simply are no more new Saudi Arabias. Now, most people will look at that and say, well, it's Greenpeace. Either I agree with them or I disagree with them because they're Greenpeace. If you're a bit more of a critical thinker, you would say, well, wait a minute. What's the context for this? How much did we need to find 10 years ago? Has it changed? Is it harder or easier? What exactly is happening? And if you're an old fart like me, you'll say, hey, you know, 40 years ago, President Jimmy Carter said the same thing. We need to find a Saudi Arabia every 3 years, and this simply can't go on. So it's kind of amazing that so many people, because we're human, start from a certain point of view, cherry pick the data, and run with it, and they don't want to hear different opinions, and they certainly don't want to see any different evidence. And that brings us to our speaker today. Alex Epstein has written a book that I think would not find a lot of a big welcome in most of Massachusetts, given what I know of Massachusetts, having lived here 40 years. The moral case for fossil fuels. And I'm going to ask him to start by talking a bit about the book, and especially start with, how did you come to write this book? What made you feel like this was a case that needed to be made?
Interestingly, it connects to the issue of bias. that you mentioned. So there's this idea that, well, human beings by nature are biased, that we're susceptible to bias. And certainly we have the capacity for bias, and bias is something that's difficult to overcome. But it's also something that can, I believe, substantially be overcome to the extent we're explicit about our reasoning process, our thinking methods. And my background is philosophy. I'm very interested in what's our reasoning process, what's our thinking method, what frameworks do we operate from. And about 10 years ago, while studying the history of Rockefeller for an article, I had this realization of something that's seemingly trivial, but I don't think most of us appreciate, which is just that energy is the fundamental industry. It's the industry that powers every other industry. And therefore, decisions, right and wrong, in energy have more leverage than just about any other kinds of decisions. And so I started, from a philosophical perspective, looking at the reasoning that was being used in energy discussions. And I was really alarmed by it. I thought it was really bad in three basic ways. One, I thought it was very biased. So I didn't know much about energy, but I could tell that when people talked about fossil fuels and nuclear power and hydroelectric power, they would almost exclusively focus on negatives. And when they would focus on solar and wind, and to some extent biofuels, they'd focused almost exclusively on positives. Even with something blatant like mining, you know, if you care about minor deaths, you should look at, hey, what are the different rates of minor deaths across different industries? But there was only concern for people dying from coal mining accidents, but nobody was interested in rare earth accidents related to the renewables. So this was just this kind of transparent bias, which that didn't make me pro-fossil fuels, but it made me anti the current thought. Another thing is just that it's sloppy. To get to the right conclusion, we need to look at the positives and negatives of every option, and we need to look at them with a high degree of precision. So if we're concerned about the impact of CO2 on climate, we have to be really clear on, is the evidence that it's mild warming or massive warming? Is it a 2-foot sea level rise in 100 years or a 20-foot sea level rise in 30 years, which is what Al Gore says? And it was amazing to me how vague and sloppy people were. They just say, oh, climate change is real. If you support fossil fuels, you must be a climate change denier. But imagine you apply that to vaccines. Let's say I say that, well, vaccines, I believe vaccine side effects are real, but the positives outweigh them. Am I a vaccine side effect denier? Right? So you can be in favor of something and acknowledge it as side effects, but think the side effects are much smaller than the benefits. And then the final thing, and the thing most dear to my heart, or offensive to my heart in a sense, is that I think that the whole debate is very anti-human. There's a shocking lack of interest in human life, what I would call human flourishing, in the discussions about energy. For example, nobody seems to care that 3 billion people in the world have virtually no energy. I mean, that's something that almost never gets covered, never gets discussed. But, I mean, just at the risk of offending the hosts of this conference, I saw the email that goes out to people. The focus is, well, let's, you know, let's compost everything, and let's not sort our trash in the wrong way, and this kind of thing. And that's what we're focused on. But what about, I mean, if you're trying to help people, why not give $2 to alleviate energy poverty? So it's really weird that our focus is not on the human. And even on the things that are supposedly human in terms of their object of concern, what people call climate change, which we can talk about as the climate impact of CO2 or climate danger. The people who claim to care the most about this, the green movement, are the ones who most oppose the most obvious solutions. So the biggest opponents of nuclear power, green movement. Biggest opponents of hydroelectric power, green movement. Biggest opponents of natural gas, green movement. Biggest opponents of geoengineering, green movement. So there's something that's going on, at least with that driving movement, that's not really, we care so much about reducing CO2. The underlying thing, which I think drives the overly high concern about CO2 in my view, is we've got this premise of being green, which means to minimize our impact on nature. And that's why people are saying they don't believe it's natural to develop nuclear power. They think it's wrong to block a free-flowing river. They think it's wrong to manipulate climate. And so the question I then have there is, so I disagree with it. I think it's a hugely wrong thing. So we're measuring things by how green they are, and I want to measure how pro-human they are. So with the issue of climate, I'm totally okay with impacting climate if it's part of something that's net good for human life. But I think a lot of the people who say they're concerned about climate change, they're not against it so much because it's provably really bad for humans, but because it's allegedly caused by humans. And I think that's a good example to think about. Are you against what you call climate change because it's bad for humans or because it's caused by humans? So my framework is, I don't want to be sloppy, I don't want to be biased, I want to look at the full context, the positives and negatives very carefully, and my standard of value, my way of measuring good and bad, is human. So I don't want to minimize human impact, I want to maximize human flourishing. And it's really that framework that led me to conclusions that seem very radical. But I think if you follow the framework, if it makes sense, the conclusions are actually pretty straightforward from fairly uncontroversial data sets.
Okay, I'm sure we're going to have great discussion in a few minutes, but let me fulfill my role as moderator and say, to what extent do you think people use, we'll say, the morality card as a way to avoid talking about the cost and benefits in any specific degree?
Well, I think people use morality in very different ways. So I regard morality as the integrating field of human action. So what morality is doing is it's defining the fundamental ends and the fundamental means, and then what it should be doing is it should be integrating knowledge about economics, knowledge of different physical sciences, knowledge of ecology. Because if our premise is, let's say we want to maximize human flourishing, well, to know the causation of that, we need as much knowledge as we can get from the other fields. But if you don't have a human standard, if you have a minimum impact standard, or if you have some sort of dogma that's unprovable, then it becomes completely detached from the rest of human knowledge, and then it just becomes, well, let's just not impact anything. Why? Well, because we shouldn't. And so, for example, to take a historical example, let's oppose DDT. Why? Well, because it's wrong to be tampering with nature. It might be hurting eggshells, but there's no measurement, human measurement, that you're integrating all your knowledge of human action with. So I view it as an integrating thing that's consistent with scientific knowledge, but I view non-human views of morality as ignoring the rest of knowledge.
Well, you mentioned the use of comprehensive data sets, but don't you agree that there's a fair amount of uncertainty, for example, how much the sea level rise is, and what I would assume somebody here will raise, the question of externalities, which many people in the environmental movement will point to and say, this is not being priced in, or not being included in your cost-benefit analysis.
So I register externalities, but remind me of the first part, because it seems like they're two separate issues.
The data set being uncertain.
Well, so, part of looking at the full context is having ways of assessing to what degree is X claim speculative, which is a really important thing to do. And one thing that goes into that is, how do you evaluate different statements from experts who are claiming different things? And one baseline thing that I do, that I talk about in the book, is I think of it as I use experts as authorities. Rather, I don't use experts as authorities. I use them as advisors. And the number one thing I want of them is I want them to explain their viewpoint, including what do they know and how do they prove it. And I think if we just subject people to that, what exactly are you saying and how can you demonstrate it? It makes a world of difference to the quality of discussion. So for example, this 97% of climate scientists say that climate change is real. This kind of very vague, sloppy thing where you don't know, wait, does that mean mild or massive? Does it mean catastrophic? Does it mean manageable? You don't know. If you ask people, okay, well, first of all, how do you know that people are even saying that? But once you get to the people, what are you saying? What exactly are you asserting about our impact on climate? And then how can you demonstrate it? To what extent can you demonstrate it? I think that those are the kinds of questions we need, so that we neither have a dogmatic relationship with experts nor an ignorant relationship with experts, which I think sometimes people who criticize different expert opinion, they'll just say, oh, well, experts are ignorant, let's throw out experts. And that is insane. Then you're losing the whole division of labor of knowledge, and our whole life depends on specialization of knowledge. Now, the externality issue, that's a certain economic terminology for just the broader issue of trying to assess, to what extent does the use of fossil fuels or anything else have a certain kind of negative consequence. So whether you call it an externality or you talk about it as a rights violation, the issue is you still have to assess what's the magnitude of our impact on climate, what's the evidence about that. So I'm happy to talk about that, but I think that's the core question is, to what extent, if any, do fossil fuels make climate more dangerous? That's how I would think of it, whether you want to think of pricing it as an externality or factoring it into the law or setting a threshold or having a cap and trade. I think that's a secondary implementation issue.
Well, to kind of go into a related subject, maybe narrow the focus or broaden it or sharpen it. The question of discount rates. This is a business school after all. Some would say what you're looking at is the costs and the harm versus the benefits in the short term, but what about intergenerational equity? That has been a big theme amongst people talking about climate change policies, and it's something people often use when they argue that we need to do things that don't appear to have an immediate benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so method point, and then I want to go into my view of the climate issue because I think that'll help clarify what I'm saying. Lost my train of thought for a second. So the long-term thing, yeah. So part of thinking about the full context, thinking about human flourishing, should be a long-range and wide-range perspective. So I haven't yet even told you my conclusion, although you can guess it from the title of the book. But no, it's important that we agree first on our framework, and then we can see how the facts add up. So yeah, part of it means you don't just think, oh, we're going to be better off next year, but we're doing something catastrophic in the future. That wouldn't be an okay reasoning process. And you have to be wide range in the sense of you want to understand things like dynamics of global ecosystems and how those affect human life, because they affect human life. If you care about human life, you need to care about the whole nature, the natural world that you live in, to the extent it affects you in a given issue. So let me just talk then about, but there's a certain premise, I think, with our impact on climate, which is we're putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, and CO2, at least in isolation, has a certain warming effect. There's a certain kind of premise that even if this isn't disastrous short term, it's inevitably disastrous long term. And I don't think that's a very questionable premise. So let me tell you what I think the data are on this. I think that the way we should think about the issue is how does fossil fuel use affect climate danger? Climate change is too vague, because change is neutral. What I'm concerned about is danger. There are kind of three basic ways, short-term and long-term, in which it can affect climate danger or positively climate livability. One is through the greenhouse effect, which is the warming impact of CO2. Two is through the fertilizer effect, which is the plant growth impact of CO2. And three is through the protection effect, or what I call the energy effect sometimes, which is if fossil fuels are indeed giving us a lot more energy than we would otherwise have, which I believe is true, and we can talk about the evidence for that. But if they give us, this abundance of energy, they give us all this extra energy, how does that energy help us protect ourselves from the naturally dangerous climate? We have to factor that in, because nature doesn't give us a safe climate that we just make dangerous. It gives us a very dangerous climate that we need to make safe. So how do things like air conditioning and heating and transportation, how do those affect climate livability? And one thing that's fascinating about this is how little attention has been paid to this statistically, because there are data sets on what has happened to climate livability over time. And I was really shocked when I found these data sets, because what my assumption was that climate is getting a little bit more dangerous, but not nearly as much as catastrophists say. So my guess was that it was exaggerated. So to give you context, in the 80s, John Holdren said, that's President Obama's lead science advisor, said that by today, we would, maybe by 2 years from now, we would have 1 billion climate-related deaths from famine. So 1 billion people would die from famine. So you had these are all old kinds of predictions that putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, tampering with nature will lead to these long-term destructive consequences. So the data on climate-related deaths are fascinating because it's actually the case that they go way, way down, very, very consistently. So from the 30s, which I think is the first time you have any kind of good data, and that's when major fossil fuels begins, to the present, you have a 98% decline in the rate of climate-related deaths, which means storms, floods, heat, cold, everything that's supposed drought, everything that's supposedly getting worse, we're 1/50th as likely to die from. And just to give you some concrete examples, in the 30s, you had several years where, adjusted for population, you had 10 million climate-related deaths a year. When I wrote the book in 2014, the latest data we had was from 2013. There were 30,000. So you're going from millions to tens of thousands. And then some people thought, well, it's gotten really bad. In the past couple of years, you just got lucky. So look at the database, nonpartisan international database, 6,416 recorded deaths in 2016. So there's something very profound that's happening. And the thing that's happening is, the thing that's really being proven is that climate safety is primarily a product of technology. So it's a really important idea. So climate safety is an interaction between the atmosphere and human beings. You can't think of just one or just the other. So like, just anecdotally think about, maybe think of a storm, like just a standard thunderstorm. And you could have a romantic evening with your spouse and just enjoy, oh, isn't it a nice storm? And that storm 300 years ago could have completely wrecked your house. So it's the same storm, maybe even got a little worse, according to people's claims, but you're safe from it now. So the idea here is that if we really care about climate safety and climate livability, it's ultimately technology in the form of building and running a resilient civilization that is priority number one. To give one more quick example, a friend of mine was telling me when I was in Houston for a few months and I was complaining about the weather before the storm, and he said, well, this is nothing because in India, it gets to 110 plus degrees and we were poor and we just had a fan and we were huddling around the fan. And so I thought of this and I thought, the big solution to the problem today is let's figure out a way to get it from 110 to 109. And my solution is, priority number one, get them a damn air conditioner. And that's what's needed around the world. Priority number one, for the purpose of climate livability and everything else, people need technology and industrialization. And anything that slows that down, I think is really, really bad. And just to wrap up the other two effects, I think the greenhouse effect is real. My sense of the data is that some impact on climate, but it's a decelerating impact, a logarithmic impact, at least when you isolate it in a lab. And it's the kind of phenomenon that seems like a real phenomenon, but not a particularly significant phenomenon, and certainly not one that is even at all relevant when compared to the imperative of technology and industrialization. So even just on pure climate grounds, we need more cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And the complete neglect of that issue, I think, is another illustration of the fact we're not really valuing human life. We're valuing minimizing our impact. So we don't think in terms of let's make climate safe for human beings. We think in terms of let's make sure we're not impacting climate at all. And I think that's a kind of asceticism that's very deadly. So I'm a real believer in thinking and in conversation. That framework comes before facts. So we have to be clear on how we're thinking about something before we process information, before we discuss things with people. So when I have a conversation with someone, I want to be really clear early on, hey, can we both agree that we want to look carefully at the pros and cons of all the alternatives? And that leads to a much better discussion because everyone will agree that that's good, but unless we state it explicitly, most of us won't do it. So if we hold ourselves to that standard, it gets a lot better. And no, by the same token, are we both saying that we want the best outcome for human beings? And sometimes there's disagreement there, and that can be interesting to talk about. But I don't think you can have a good conversation unless you know by what standard, by what goal are you judging things as good and bad. But because I frame the issue as what policy toward fossil fuels is good for human life, with climate impact as one variable versus a binary yes and no, I believe that we impact climate, I don't really fall into that category. And if someone calls me that, which is pretty rare, it's happened once in a while, I'll just say, well, I think of myself as a climate thinker. I want to understand our impact on climate and factor it into the rest of my thinking about what's good for human life. And that's a hard kind of thing to respond to.
Yeah, you mentioned before the session that the New York Times did not review your book, and that was the only best-selling science book that was not reviewed.
I don't know that. That was my guess, but they certainly. So there has been an interesting reaction of people not engaging the book. So it's, in general, I don't deserve any sympathy. I mean, I'm really grateful. I'm grateful that I got the opportunity to write the thing, which was fortuitous. And there was one agent who thought it could get published and get a real contract with Penguin. I thought there was no chance, but he believed in it, so that was great. And they paid me to write the book, and a lot of people bought the book. And a lot of people who expected to disagree with the book liked it and told me, and then a lot of people expected to agree with it, liked it, and that was good too. What was disappointing, though not shocking, was that the thought leaders who are claiming to be in the scientific vanguard and to have thought processes and data sources that are unimpeachable, they didn't take it upon themselves to respond to this book, even though it was quite influential on a lot of people that they would presumably care about. And the most substantial response, which I'm grateful to this person for responding, is by Professor Jody Freeman, who's a professor at Harvard Law School. And I would, this is a good chance for me to mention, did the cards get handed out, by the way?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So you have cards there. The purpose of those, if you're interested, is just emailing you some resources that you can look at more, and then I hope share with others. One of the things I'm going to email out is Jody Freeman's review of my book, and then fortunately the journal, the Energy Law Journal, allowed me to respond. And I think it's always really interesting to see debate, that's why I do a lot of just in-person debates, but you can see the written debate. So you can read what she wrote, read what I wrote, and I think that you'll get an indication of what is difficult for my opponents in grappling with my view, and that they really can't acknowledge my framework and acknowledge my exact view, so they'll straw man it and say things like, Alex Epstein thinks we should use fossil fuels forever, we shouldn't consider alternatives, which is insane, because I'm a huge advocate of nuclear power. More broadly, I'm a huge advocate of energy freedom and competition, and I'm a human being, so why the hell wouldn't I want a way better source of energy? That's a kind of confession. Like, people who really have one fetish. I write about fossil fuels because I think fossil fuels are super important and they're misunderstood, not because I have a fetish for oil. But I think people do have a fetish for solar and wind, which is weird to me, because I don't care where it comes from, I just care what process is overall the best.
I'll actually mention along those lines, if you watch the movie Who Killed the Electric Car, the first one, the regulator is quoted as saying, it's not my job to promote electric cars, it's my job to clean up the air. And it is amazing. I mean, I'm not surprised the nuclear power industry says nuclear power is the solution. But there are a lot of people outside the energy industry who promote specific types, usually renewables, for their own sake. Why don't we throw it open to some questions? I see a lot of smiles. I don't know if they're knowing smiles or sarcastic smirks. But no insults, no long speeches, but comments and questions are welcome.
I'm okay with the insults, but the long speeches I agree with.
I have a teenage daughter, so you can't insult me worse than she does.
Yes, up there.
And speak loudly.
Of course. To say, oddly enough, I've actually tackled with change leadership, and some of my course is actually at Northeastern University over there. And one of the points that was made early on is that people tend not to change unless they're uncomfortable. And so as we're talking about this whole, climate change and climate issue, it's like, well, perhaps the Earth is just trying to, give us a hint, make us a little bit more uncomfortable to develop the technologies needed. And so we were talking about, these, what do you call them, the cataclysmic prophets or whatever they are?
Catastrophists?
Yeah, catastrophists, fantastic word for it. And so they're sitting there and they're like, oh, we're going to imagine what's going to happen 10 years in the future with the technology of today. And of course that's why they're going to give some outrageous figure for how many people are going to die, because they're not imagining what people are going to come up with in their own creative devices. And so that's my opinion.
So, I think a really interesting thing there is the assumption in predictions about human beings that human beings are repetitive, mindless creatures. There is that kind of assumption. And interestingly, the kinds of practices that we idealize and want today, I think wrongly, involve us being repetitive, mindless creatures. So sustainability really boils down to repeatability. Like, let's find something that we can do over and over and over and over. Or renewability, which I hate as a concept. Like, I don't care about, why do I care if the raw energy is naturally replenishing for 5 billion years? Like, I want the energy process that's overall the best for human beings. The same way, I don't want a renewable phone. Like, I don't need it to be made of all renewable. I want the best thing. And the way human beings work is we're not repetitive creatures, we're progressive creatures. So we keep finding new and better ways to do things as long as we're free to do so. So to that extent, yes, that's part of what's happening with climate. But another thing that's just happening with climate is it's not that the energy sources got replaced because we're using way more fossil fuels than we were 35 years ago. It's simply that this extreme negative impact that was postulated has not come to fruition, and this extreme positive impact of using technology to master our climate, that completely ignored variable, has proven dominant.
Yeah, I would add to that, we have a tendency to think in terms of magic bullets, and I don't know if that's, you know, werewolf myths or Hollywood or whatever, but people don't think that a solution to a big problem is a lot of little things. It's the one big thing, usually the one big thing I'm researching or trying to sell you. If you go back to the 70s, it was common to say, okay, there's conventional oil and there's synthetic fuels like liquefied coal, and we have to go from one to the other. And it turned out that there was natural gas substitution, there was upgrading of heavy oil, and just all kinds of things that most people didn't even consider. And it's kind of the same thing, and I think this is where you get this sort of the meeting of the minds, the technophiles who say, you know, we could do these things. The question is, are we doing them, and what exactly are we doing? And that's why, spoiler alert, I favor a carbon tax. Another question. Yeah.
I didn't know that. All right, well, that would be an interesting discussion.
There's a lot of reasons. Yeah, we'll have to slug it out later. But,
yeah, I do not.
Okay, we have a question up there, and then the host.
I just want to pick you up on one point you said. You cited the example of somebody in India where we need to use them, you know, not look at bringing temperature from 110 to 109, but we need to get in the fan. And obviously, as you say, climate change being a long rhythm pattern, at what point in the future should we start to move away from using the current energy resources we have to be better for the population globally, and then start to look at bringing that temperature down, really focusing on some sort of new climate change tapping initiative?
Well, I mean, it's conceivable that the way the warming impact works, that we couldn't warm it all that much even if we wanted to. So, you know, my primary points here are in terms of method. So I think it's important to remain open to evidence about the warming impact of CO2. Hopefully people will be able to develop better models and simulations than the ones they have now, which are quite primitive in terms of predictive ability. So my guess, but it's just a guess, is that we're not going to reach a point where it's an issue. I don't think there's any magical average temperature. I mean, in terms of the history of the Earth, we're at a very low point in temperature and a very low point in CO2. So we're not like in any uncharted territory geologically. But I will say that the right energy policy, the right baseline energy policy, which I think is primarily energy freedom, is the exact energy policy that you need if you're concerned about CO2 emissions. Because think about what's actually going to be necessary to displace a lot of hydrocarbon energy. It's, to the extent that was desirable or even possible, it's going to have to be somebody comes up with a cheap, plentiful, reliable way to produce non-carbon energy. I think the most promising one at this point would be nuclear, and particularly taking off all the insane restrictions that the green movement has put on that industry for the past 40 or 50 years. But the broad thing there is that's not a special thing for nuclear. It's just we need to get rid of pseudoscientific policies that impute a lot of danger to something that's actually very safe. So one thing in terms of having a pro-freedom energy policy is everyone should be held to the same safety standards. You shouldn't be able to hold nuclear power 1 million times the safety standards as everything else. I think that there's a lot of reasonable disagreement about very long-term impacts of CO2, and so while I don't think it's that big a priority, people who prioritize it should be innovating new sources of energy. To my knowledge, you have innovation within hydrocarbon, but the other innovations are almost by nature going to be non-carbon. So what we really want to do is encourage that and absolutely not privilege what they call renewables, which is a very misleading term in part because the renewable people exclude hydro. So really what they advocate are unreliables at this point, solar and wind. But we shouldn't be in favor of the energy that's green, that's renewable. We should be in favor of the best energy for human life. So get rid of that renewable shackle that I think is holding back non-carbon energy.
I'll just mention I often get in trouble for pointing out to people that whales are a renewable resource, but nobody thinks we should use whale oil instead of fossil fuels. There's an excellent book called A Policy of Our Discontent by Vito Stagliano, who was in the first Bush administration, the good one. And he talks about how there's a complete disconnect between the energy experts and the politicians when energy policy is being made. It's kind of depressing. It doesn't give you a sense that the future of energy policy is that bright. Greg.
Yeah, sure. Alex, thank you for coming. I have a question. I understand the climate safety argument, bringing the temperature down with an air conditioner makes sense to me. I guess my question is, how do you apply your framework to a situation where, even in the milder climate change scenarios, sea level rise makes some pretty large, densely populated areas uninhabitable, and a lot of those areas happen to be, very poorly economically developed. So there's a limited ability for those people to move. So how do you walk through that issue?
Well, I mean, in terms of the framework, one of the first things is, okay, what is the evidence for this? What's the magnitude of this? And then what can be done? What are your different options for dealing with it? What do those cost? But my basic stock answer is that we're not thinking nearly technologically enough about how to deal with sea level rise, which is an inevitable thing, at least as long as we're not in an ice age. Because if you look at just the Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is super anti-fossil fuel, but they're very clear on the last 20,000 years of sea level rise, which is that it's like this. So sea level rise is slower now than it has been for most of human history. So we sort of got lucky. So there's a question of, are we making it a little less slow than it was 10, 15,000 years ago when our ancestors had to deal with it with zero technology? So I think that in general, with climate, there's this general attribution of everything is the fault of fossil fuels, so people don't look at natural causes or even things like man-made causes like lower, even land masses sinking and that kind of thing. And above all, they don't think technologically about the solutions. Because they're just different countries, like Netherlands, deal with sea level different ways. To the extent this is a problem, our number one focus should be how do we technologically master it? Because that's the way, if you actually care about the people, that's your guaranteed way of actually saving a lot of people. It's really remarkable to me that with all the environmental issues in the world, people are very anti-technology in their thinking. Like with the hurricanes, why aren't people talking about, why isn't Elon Musk on some project to neutralize hurricanes? I mean, why don't we think in terms of real man-made climate change in the good sense of let's try to control the natural world in better ways. Let's deal with sea level rises. So my basic view is way too much attribution to fossil fuels, usually exaggeration, but most of all a lack of having a pro-technology solution. I think that there's a religious element to the green framework, which is we shouldn't impact nature. We believe that nature is this stable, safe, sufficient mother that wants to take care of us, and so we think, oh, well, if we disrupt our mother, then we deserve to get punished. And I don't believe this at all. I don't believe in a perfect planet. I believe in a perfectible planet. I believe that it's dynamic, dangerous, deficient. There's lots of potential, but we got to change it a lot to make our lives better. Sometimes our change will be less than ideal, but overall it's been really good. We should keep trying to change it and make it better.
Alex will be at the Divinity School next week.
No.
Hi, my name is Diego. Thanks for your talk. So you made a really good point about climate change and why, even though fossil fuels make climate or make the world warmer, energy is actually good for humanity. But I wanted to know, what are your thoughts on pollution from fossil fuels? Because I think we can agree that pollution is harmful for humanity, right?
Well, I mean, so this is an interesting issue of the full context. So let's just go back, X 100,000 years, and you and I are getting to make the decision: do we use fire or not? And you say, well, it's obvious that pollution is harmful to humanity. The smoke from the fire is much worse than anything you get even in China right now, living there. So, this is obviously bad, right? So we shouldn't tolerate it. Well, but it's part of a package that's good. So part of what communities and societies have to do is they have to judge the whole package. Now, part of what they want to do is optimize the package as much as possible, whether that's by minimizing the negative byproduct from fossil fuel and then making the energy more affordable, or by finding a superior replacement. But in many, many cases, I think it's good to have, a relatively small amount of emissions. I mean, I think it's good, particularly for poor countries, to have a relatively small amount of emissions and a lot of energy. Also, in terms of looking precisely at things, I think that the claims that are made about X deaths caused by air pollution do not stand any sort of, there's no actual causation that they're demonstrating at all. So there's lots of really sloppy correlation stuff. So that's part of the issue too, is you need to A, assess the full costs and benefits, and B, really assess the evidence, because people just love to say, oh, X number of people died from air pollution from this, and we have this mental model of the smoke comes in and causes cancer, but I think I'm dubious of it for many reasons. One, if anyone is interested in this issue and the details of this, I have a podcast called Power Hour, which I'll link to in the email that I sent, and we had a podcast with a guy named Edward Calabrese, and he is sort of an expert on dosage levels and statistical studies of how much of something is actually harmful, and he had some really interesting comments on this.
Okay. One more. There was somebody had a hand up over here.
Oh, boy. This one's
Yeah,
very
okay,
determined.
yes, go ahead.
And then
please.
I want to make a 30-second comment at the end.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So you mentioned just now about pollution in China, and there are very different views on that. Many people think it's just horrible, but some other people feel that given the size of the population, which is 1.4 billion, you have to do a lot of things to feed those people to make sure they can at least keep on living. And as a result, you have to keep the plant operating and causing pollution. So overall, it could be a net gain. So what's your view on that?
I think the way you're thinking of it is good. So it could be a net gain. I mean, my very strong guess, I would say I know, is that there are many things that they could do that would not be super costly, that would make things a lot better in terms of pollution. And one thing you have there is that's not a fully free country at all, and the government is often on the premise of doing things that benefit some groups or that benefit the government that are at the expense of other individuals. And I think that's completely contrary to my own concept of human flourishing, which is very much that every individual matters. So it's not okay to just pipe smoke in one person's house in order to make these two neighbors better off. But to your point, it's important to recognize that the goal in China should not be zero emissions. If our goal is zero emissions, we can just all kill ourselves. Right? The goal is maximum life. So we want the emissions level that's consistent with maximum life. Now I want to, first of all, I want to thank Mike for doing this. This is the first time I've ever gotten to request a moderator. And one reason I wanted Mike is because I think he is on the same page as I am with regard to the issue of, and he can completely contradict me, but at least I consider him a very good refuter of mass delusion in the realm of peak oil. And I am very interested in mass delusion as a phenomenon. And I think that we completely are ahistorical when we act like, well, our views and our consensus and our experts are right, but of course all those idiots in the past were wrong when they did eugenics and communism and Nazism. right? And they did all those things in the name of science, by the way. So I think that we have to have an awareness, a historical awareness, that it's possible, I believe, due mostly to bad thinking methods, for large amounts of very smart people to draw wrong conclusions and take very wrong actions. And with the peak oil issue, I'd say Mike has been one of my heroes on that issue. He was on my podcast. He was my second guest ever in 2011, March 1st. And I read him this quote earlier, but he said, and this is when oil was high and everyone said it can't go down. He said, over the next 5 to 15 years, I think we're going to see a lot more oil produced. There's almost certainly going to be heavy pressure on price to bring it back down to at least below $50, maybe below $40. So now, as he would be the first to say, that one prediction doesn't mean he's some kind of genius. You should look at the rest of his track record. But the lesson, no, I'm not saying it's bad. but I just that I don't believe in proving things by one example. But I think the broader lesson that we should really look at different ideas and look at the full track record of those ideas and be aware that large numbers of people can think badly. And then I think our protection against that, our protection against being one of the bad guys when people look back at us, is to think consciously about our thinking method and about our bias. So I try to have my framework always thinking about the full context and human flourishing. I think that gives me a better chance of being right, and hopefully that's useful to you as well. And thank you for having me. Fill out your cards, and if you're watching this online, just email Harvard resources to alex@alexepstein.com.
Thank you all.